Diana managed to secretly film what happened next. Officers stormed in and started grabbing men in the flank. A man in plain clothes wearing a black mask and body armor lashed out with a baton at those who resisted. Women raised their hands, begging not to take them.
I was so scared. They took several boys. The women hid the rest. One was behind the sofa, another one was hiding in a cupboard. The third was on the balcony.
With continuing police violence, the demonstrations have got smaller. The mood has changed too.
There are fewer opposition flags. The festive atmosphere has gone. Every time you go out to join a protest march, you don't know whether you'll be back or not. You're very nervous.
Ignat, not his real name, is an entrepreneur. He was arrested and badly beaten in detention in August. But after leaving the prison with his legs and back covered with bruises, he is even more determined to protest.
Many people don't come out anymore because they're afraid. I know that I will continue though. We have nowhere to go. If we lose, Lukashenko will turn the country into North Korea. If we stop, I see no possibility of living here. Then, the only option would be to emigrate.
One of those still willing to protest. Speaking out of Belarus to the BBC's Abdul Abdurasulov. You're listening to News Hour, much more to come in the next 30 minutes, including the musical sensation that he's nominated to become the US's next top diplomat. We'll have that story coming up.
Distribution of the BBC NewsHour in the U.S. is supported by Duolingo, a language learning app built around the idea that learning should be fun to keep learners motivated. With bite-sized lessons in more than 34 languages, Duolingo is available as an app or at duolingo.com. And One Drop, the app that can help people get healthy and stay ahead of their diabetes. Guided by behavioral science, One Drop combines one-on-one health coaching, an interactive learning experience, and diabetes supply delivery. Available at getonedrop.com.
It's 1:30. Stay tuned for more from the BBC World Service just ahead on 94.9 KUOW, online at KUOW.org.
Support for KUOW comes from Island Books on Mercer Island, celebrating 47 years of serving the local community with a wide selection of books, puzzles, games, and toys. Celebrating Small Business Saturday on Saturday, November 28th. More at islandbooks.com, Facebook, and Instagram. Pfizer and Moderna, the companies with vaccine success so far, have gotten there fast. The formula includes a whole lot of money, some luck, and
researchers and the efforts to reach potential research subjects. And it's also, I think, a testament of individuals who volunteered.
I'm Kai Rizdal. How production is going so fast, and some of the costs that speed has. Next time on Marketplace at 2:30 and 6:30 p.m. on KUOW 94.9 and KUOW.org. BBC News with Chris Barrow. The US President-elect Joe Biden has chosen a veteran foreign policy official, Antony Blinken, to be his new Secretary of State in a sharp break with the approach of the Trump administration. Mr. Blinken, who has strong internationalist views, worked with Mr. Biden under President Obama. Avril Haines will be the first woman nominated to be Director of National Intelligence. The leader of Ethiopia's Tigray region, where nearly 3 weeks of fighting has left hundreds of people dead, has rejected the Prime Minister's ultimatum to surrender by Wednesday. Debretsion Gebremichael denied that TPLF troops were on the point of defeat. China has launched a mission to try to retrieve rock samples from the moon, the first to be collected in more than 40 years. Its robotic Chang'e 5 spacecraft blasted off early on Tuesday morning, Beijing time. If successful, it should return to Earth in mid-December. The American money transfer company Western Union has ceased its operations in Cuba following months of pressure from the Trump administration. The measure will have a huge impact on the incomes of thousands of Cuban families. The head of the World Health Organization says a new coronavirus vaccine developed in Britain is more evidence that the light at the end of the tunnel is growing brighter. But Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus warned that the poor could now be trampled in the stampede for protection. The Australian airline Qantas has said immunisation against the coronavirus will be mandatory in future for its international travellers. The head of Qantas, Alan Joyce, said the move would be a necessity once vaccines become widely available. Spain's royal palace says King Felipe is self-isolating after coming into contact with a person who tested positive for the coronavirus. In a statement, the palace said the king had suspended all official activities for the 10-day mandatory quarantine period. BBC News.
Next on News Hour, did the Israeli Prime Minister meet the Saudi Crown Prince? Before that, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that just under 3 weeks ago there was an election in the United States. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump, except that Mr. Trump hasn't conceded, and not all the states, especially those where Mr. Biden won by a relatively slim margin, have formally announced, or in the jargon, certified their result. Today's attention is squarely focused on Michigan. Earlier I was joined by Zoe Clark, the program director of Michigan Radio, to explain what's going on.
Try to explain what's going on. There's a lot here in Michigan happening today.
Well, Joe Biden, from what I understand, won the state by 150,000 votes, and yet
we still have to certify those results. So it's a long process. Each state has their own way of doing it here in the U.S., and so what has to happen is a board called the State Board of Canvassers has to certify those 154,000 votes that went to Joe Biden. And this board is made up of, you guessed it, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and there's been some talk about whether they will go forward, the 2 Republicans, in certifying, because you have to have at least one of those Republicans vote yes. And so right now, we are in the middle of public comment that the board from clerks all over the state, and we are now into about 2.5 hours of comments and no end in sight.
So have these Republican members of the board suggested that there might be doubt?
Well, they sure have suggested that they are not comfortable certifying the count. The fact is, though, that is not their job to cast doubt or to ask for audits, which is what some Republicans are pressuring. This is a ministerial job they have. All they are meant to do is vote yay or vote nay, and some Republicans, including Trump supporters, are pushing them to do more. And so what you're seeing right now in the public comment is this back and forth about what exactly the state constitution says is their job.
And presumably, Zoe, the fact that it's been 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, so, you might say, well, that's just set up to cause problems because you could have a tie. Presumably in the past, it hasn't been the case because it is seen normally as a bit of a formality.
Indeed, and this is just yet another instance of the 2020 election being unlike anything we've seen before. Now, it could be that after these comments, it appears that one of the Republicans might be swayed. He's been asking questions directly to some attorneys who have been on about what exactly is my job. He appears to be looking for an out. But again, as I said, it is the year 2020 and anything can happen.
Zoe Clark, program director of Michigan Radio, speaking to me from Ann Arbor. This is the BBC World Service and live from London News Hour with me, Tim Franks. Reports in the Israeli media say that an extraordinary, unprecedented meeting took place on Sunday. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, flew to Saudi Arabia, to the Red Sea city of Neom, for a meeting with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, along with the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The Saudi Foreign Minister has denied that it ever happened. For his part, Mr. Netanyahu, when asked by reporters about it, was rather more equivocal.
Are you serious? Friends, throughout my years, I have never commented on such things, and I don't intend to start doing so now. I can only tell you that really, throughout my years as Prime Minister, I have spared no effort to strengthen the State of Israel and to expand the circle of peace. We are managing to do it with our neighbors, with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Sudan, and I hope the circle will always expand.
And when it comes to Sudan, there have also been reports today of a group of senior Israeli officials visiting that country for the first time since Israel and Sudan made moves to normalize their relationship. Barak Ravid broke the story of that reported meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister and the Saudi Crown Prince. He's diplomatic correspondent at Walla News and a contributor to the Axios news website. Speaking from Tel Aviv, he gave me details of his story.
2 Israeli officials and 1 U.S. official confirmed to me that there was indeed such a meeting yesterday between Netanyahu and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in Neom yesterday.
I guess, clearly, for the Israelis, they would like to say the diplomacy is going ahead at a great pace. We've already had these 3 accords with Bahrain, UAE and Sudan, and Saudi obviously would be the great prize. I presume for Saudi Arabia, it's not such wonderful news that this is leaked.
I think that it depends on who you ask in the Saudi government and at what hour you ask this question. Because there is no chance whatsoever that the Saudis were not well aware, because you cannot hide a private jet that departs from Tel Aviv, has a direct flight to Neom and lands there and then comes back after a few hours at the same time that the Secretary of State of the United States and the Crown Prince are there. Maybe they were not totally aware of how big of a story it will be and what kind of shockwaves it will create across the region and across the world. And I think that this is maybe why the Saudis at a certain point changed their line to denying that such a meeting ever took place and trying to distance themselves from the whole thing. But you know what? The fact that they denied it is almost a given. But the fact that this story, there are many ways that the Saudis or the Americans or the Israelis could stop such a story from being published. I'll give you one example. In Israel, there is a military censorship system that very sensitive national security stories in the press needs to be sent to military censor in advance. And most of the time, the military censor doesn't do anything. You just say, okay. But this is one of those stories that usually you know that if you send it to the military censor, they're not going to let you publish. And this morning, when I sent it to the military censor, they didn't care. And it shows you that at the end of the day, the government here wanted this story to come out.
That's fascinating. But Barak, is there anyone in Israel, in the political establishment, I mean, maybe in the governing coalition, who might say this actually isn't great news for Israel? Because, Saudi Arabia, after all, is a pretty despotic place. It's got a terrible reputation when it comes to human rights and the war in Yemen. Or is it just seen as a zero-sum game that the biggest enemy that Israel has is Iran? So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
First, there are 2 people that weren't too happy about this whole thing, not because they have a problem with Saudi Arabia or with relations with Saudi Arabia, but because they were left in the dark about this whole trip. And those are Netanyahu's main coalition partners, Minister of Defense Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi. Both of them did not know. They heard about it in the press. Can you imagine a situation where the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Minister they don't know when the Prime Minister goes for meetings with Saudi Arabia? This is really insane. But when you look at Israel's neighborhood, last time I checked, it's hard to find there too many Jeffersonian democracies. So at the end of the day, you deal with the cards you have. And for Israel to be accepted in the region, to be legitimized by the United Arab Emirates, by Bahrain, by Sudan, and maybe in the near future by Saudi Arabia, that's a dramatic change. That's an earthquake. Because if there's one thing that Israelis wanted all those years is to be accepted as part of the region and not as some sort of a colonial implant from the outside that was inserted into the region by the world powers. And the fact that, Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates, beforehand it was Jordan and Egypt, and now maybe Saudi Arabia, this is a huge shift in the region. And you're right, the main reason for it is the big concern in the region from Iran and from what the next U.S. administration might do when it comes to the maybe resuming the Iran nuclear deal from 2015. And I think that this concern caused this realignment in the region that you see right now. And it has a lot of good things in it. It also has some negative things in it. One example is that Israeli leaders think that when they get those new relationships with the Arab world, they can put aside the Palestinian issue as if it's not a problem anymore. The only thing is that it's not going anywhere. Those 6 million Palestinians who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean are not going anywhere. And the Israeli government, the Israeli people will have to solve this conflict. And having relations with Saudi Arabia is great, having relations with the UAE is great, but at the end of the day, our next door neighbors are the Palestinians and not anybody else.
Barak Ravid. Donald Trump still pointedly hasn't conceded, although he's just within the last few minutes been hit with another setback, with Michigan formally certifying that the state did vote for Biden. Anyway, formally, Donald Trump still hasn't allowed the transition to get going. But in the meantime, that is precisely what is happening, at least as far as it can, with President-elect Joe Biden making a series of announcements about who his senior staff will be. We now know that his nominee to be the new Secretary of State will be Antony Blinken, a man with whom he's worked closely for years, has a lot of foreign policy experience, and an entirely unrelated talent, which we will be exhibiting to the global glare in just a few minutes. First, let's take a look at his diplomatic chops with our State Department correspondent, Barbara Pletasha.
He's quite cosmopolitan. His formative years took place in Paris, and so he speaks French. He's graduated from Harvard and Columbia Law School. And he has a long history with Joe Biden, so really he's the safest pair of hands from Joe Biden's point of view that he could have picked for top diplomat. He's been advising him in a foreign policy manner for around 20 years or so. In fact, they are so close that some call him an alter ego of Mr. Biden, that they have a mind meld. He has a lot of experience in foreign policy roles. First came into the White House during the Clinton administration. He was obviously part of President Obama's foreign policy and diplomatic team as well. So he does bring a lot of experience to the role. He has a little bit of a lighter touch than some other secretaries of state, which I think you alluded to. He is a member of a band. He plays the guitar. He's supposed to be a really nice guy and very inclusive, perhaps too inclusive. He's sometimes said to carry on meetings too long and be too slow to make decisions. Aggressively nice, actually, is how I wanted to say he's been called. Right. So, yeah, it should be interesting.
Right. And in terms of policy priorities, are there any clues as to where, given the enormous Rolodex of crises and problems that inevitably will be facing him, like any new administration, any idea what the priorities might be?
Yes, because he's the top foreign policy advisor of Mr. Biden's campaign, so he's been really out there saying what they would be. And the number one priority is to rejoin the international community and push back against President Trump's America First policy. So that would involve re-engaging with allies, especially NATO allies, rejoining treaties and agreements and institutions that Mr. Trump abandoned. I expect that he will have more of a foreign policy focus. Just recently, he came out with a more critical statement than the State Department did when Egypt arrested some human rights activists. He will also be focused on China, and his focus there, like Mr. Biden's, will be to try to build a sort of multilateral response to issues of technology and trade and human rights and so on. So those are some of the issues that he will be focusing on, but really he presents himself as somebody who can help restore American leadership and promote democracy.
And there's been a slew of other appointments, or at least nominations today, including some rather eye-catching ones, and indeed one that broke just as we were coming on air. What can you tell us about that?
So, yeah, you're talking about Janet Yellen there. She's the former head of the Federal Reserve, and she has been appointed Treasury Secretary. So she's the first woman appointed to lead the Treasury in its 231-year history. She will have a very critical role because she's going to be at the forefront of navigating this pandemic economic crisis. Another top name, former Secretary of State John Kerry. He's come up again as Special Envoy for Climate, which is a new role and shows how much that Mr. Biden wants to highlight it and treat it as a national security issue. He brings a lot of stature, of course, vast experience, although I'm not sure he's going to excite the young climate activists who voted for Mr. Biden. And then some names that maybe are not so well known. Jake Sullivan is National Security Advisor. He's also very much a seasoned member of the Obama White House. He helped to open the back channel with Iran that led to the nuclear agreement. And another one, Linda Thomas Greenfield, again not a household name, but she is a 35-year history of working in the State Department as a diplomat, very long-serving career diplomat. She was sidelined by the Trump administration. She's a black woman, and she has been appointed as UN ambassador. So this is a commitment that Mr. Biden had made to have diversity in his cabinet, and she will be a member of the cabinet because he's upgraded the post.
And just very briefly, Barbara, in terms of some of these nominations, they will have to get through the Senate, be confirmed there. The Senate may well remain in Republican hands. Could any of these nominations prove difficult to get through?
Well, they could if the Republicans want to make an issue of it, but Mr. Biden has carefully chosen his candidates as quite centrist and traditional. He has not taken up any of the ones that were, for example, more on the left wing, so he has picked them in mind to having as easy a ride through the confirmation process as possible.
That was our State Department correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher. Now, I mentioned that Anthony Blinken, President-elect Joe Biden's nominee to be the new Secretary of State, had an entirely unrelated talent. Here it is. I noticed that he's gone up from 53 Spotify followers earlier on today to 57. What a sensation.
Distribution of BBC NewsHour in the U.S. is supported by Duolingo, a language learning app built around the idea that learning should be fun. With more than 34 languages, including endangered languages, Duolingo is available as an app for download. And HIMS, offering men access to licensed medical professionals online who can evaluate conditions including ED. Online prescriptions available if appropriate. More at 4hims.com/2020.
Carter Subaru supports KUOW's car donation program.
Hi, this is Bill Radke with a big thank you to our members who make our coverage of the news possible, including expanded coverage of COVID-19.
Hi, I'm Kim Malcolm. One more way to help is to donate a vehicle. We'll plow that money right back into comprehensive coverage of the day's top stories.
Hi, I'm Marcy Silman. Donate that unwanted vehicle at 1-866-KUOW-CAR.
The KUOW car donation program is powered by Carter Subaru in Ballard, Shoreline, and at cartersubaru.com.
A reminder of our top story this hour. The World Health Organization has welcomed the promising trial results of a new coronavirus vaccine, but in the words of the WHO boss, has warned that the poor must not be left out in the stampede. The epidemiologist Larry Brilliant, who worked on the eradication of smallpox back in the 1970s, gave NewsHour his reaction.
Unfortunately, these days we have forces that tear us apart, and we forget sometimes that we are tied together so inextricably and all in it together. A pandemic reminds us of that, and the response to a pandemic reminds us how important it is that we cooperate globally.
One other headline story we've been looking at, Joe Biden has chosen a veteran U.S. foreign policy official with internationalist views, Anthony Blinken, to be his new Secretary of State, in a sharp break with President Trump's approach. This is NewsHour, live from the BBC. I'm Tim Franks. Ahead of the US election, President Trump insisted that the country was turning a corner on the pandemic. If indeed it has, it seems to have turned into the path of a towering wave. Over the past week, there have been an average of more than 170,000 cases a day, an increase of more than a half on the rate 2 weeks earlier. Hospitalizations and deaths are similarly surging. The BBC's Neda Tawfik reports from Nebraska, a state spared early in the crisis, but now experiencing one of the fastest outbreaks in the nation.
At the Nebraska Medical Center, the team works to intubate another patient starved of oxygen due to COVID.
You guys have what you need, compressors?
Placing those in their care on ventilators is a treatment of last resort. But more and more here, the ill are losing the fight against the deadly virus. And nurses say never before have things been so dire.
We have, I think they said 10 COVID units. And one of those is just a place for people to go and pass away, unfortunately.
More than 1,700 of Nebraska's healthcare providers signed a letter pleading with people to wear masks. Doctors Christopher and Thomas Marston were the ones who wrote it.
It's very worrisome, and it's also emotionally draining in itself to see that there's people out there not taking the precautions that we need, not taking this seriously still. And we're seeing numbers rise at such a rate that there won't be a bed for you. There won't be someone to take care for you. A case that really stands out to me is when I had this middle-aged gentleman who we had been doing our best to not intubate, not to get to the point where we had to put him on the ventilator. And his breathing just got to the point where we had to make that decision. And he begged us to call his wife so he could say goodbye to her one more time before we put him on the ventilator, because he knew that that was goodbye. And we see it over and over again. And it's tough.
I just wonder, how much do you find yourself in a position of not just fighting this virus, but the misinformation around this virus?
I think it's emotionally exhausting to listen to the patients who come in and are bordering getting intubated and telling us that they don't believe in the virus. So it's kind of a scary thing to see.
Or saying that they wish they would have taken it seriously sooner.
Despite the current circumstances, the state's Republican Governor Pete Ricketts, who is an ally of President Trump, continues to reject the idea of a statewide mask mandate.
I don't think mask mandates are appropriate. I think that they breed resistance.
To the dismay of health professionals, some still view mask requirements as an infringement on their civil liberties. But in neighboring states such as North Dakota and Iowa, other Republican governors are now reversing course as the virus spreads rampantly.
Our situation has changed, and we must change with it. To be clear, these are statewide requirements, not simply recommendations.
Now through December 10th, when your indoor masks are required to be worn.
The Fuscos are used to big gatherings like this past Christmas celebration. Across the country, COVID has devastated families, like this close-knit Italian-American one in New Jersey. Maria, along with more than a dozen relatives, contracted the virus, and 5 others died from it. She wants people to understand the ongoing risk and the heartbreak of losing loved ones that way.
I just didn't even know what was happening. I mean, to be in a hospital for 30 days fighting for my life, by the time me and my brother got up, they had already had the funeral.
The strain on families has indeed been hard. Yet there's a fear that some Americans have grown numb to the staggering death toll, and that the upcoming holiday season of joy could turn into a season of sorrow.
There's Tawfik reporting on what's happening in Nebraska. We began the program talking about the latest excellent news on vaccine development and how far we can all across the world benefit. The boss of a major airline has now gone a little further and said that proof of vaccination should be mandatory for international air passengers in future. Alan Joyce, who runs the Australian flag carrier Qantas, said that he thought it was a view shared by other airlines around the globe. Sally Geffen is the editor of Geffen's In-Flight News. How likely is it that the Qantas proposal will take off?
At the moment, all we have is one airline CEO coming out with this statement, and at the moment, he does stand alone. The airline does stand alone in making this announcement and taking this approach. And it's a little bit in contradiction of the global airline industry body, IATA, which represents the top airlines around the world and is going for a slightly different approach. But it's early days.
I suppose, conceivably, Qantas might say, well, we've got a slightly better case to argue for people to be vaccinated because people are going to be, our flights from Australia perforce take rather longer than a lot of other airlines' flights, and therefore we want to make sure that the people who are on board have maximum protection from other passengers, and indeed the same for our crew. So it's a way of reassuring everybody.
Yes, it could be seen as a way of reassurance. I think rather it's a strategy in line